Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
For years, Florida has been the punchline of every weird news segment in America. Alligators in swimming pools, iguanas falling out of trees when it gets cold. And now, headlines claiming the state deliberately unleashed thousands of snake-killing creatures into the wild, as if it was some mad scientist plan to fight fire with fire. People online laughed. They mocked the state for supposedly cooking up another one of its bizarre wildlife experiments. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Florida didn't release anything on purpose. The truth is stranger, messier, and far more unsettling than the meme headlines suggest. And once you understand what's actually happening in the Everglades, you'll never look at Florida's snake problem the same way again. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the actual villain of this story, the Burmese python. This isn't a native Florida animal. It's a massive constrictor snake from Southeast Asia, capable of growing close to 20 feet long and weighing well over 100 pounds. Decades ago, exotic pet owners across the country fell in love with these snakes. They were cheap, dramatic, and impressive to own, right up until they outgrew the average living room. Some escaped. Some were deliberately released by owners who could no longer handle a snake the size of a small car. And by the 1980s and 1990s, a wild population had taken hold in the swamps of South Florida, an environment that turned out to be almost eerily perfect for them. Warm, wet, full of prey, and completely lacking any natural predator capable of stopping them. What followed was one of the most dramatic biological invasions in modern American history. The pythons didn't just survive in the Everglades, they thrived. Female Burmese pythons can lay dozens of eggs in a single clutch. They can go months without eating, which makes them almost impossible to detect through traditional trapping. And because they blend so seamlessly into marshland and sawgrass, an adult python can lie within a few feet of a hiking trail and go completely unnoticed. Wildlife officials have spent years trying to even estimate how many are out there, and the numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates put the population in the tens of thousands, while some researchers believe the true number could be in the hundreds of thousands once you account for how difficult they are to find. The ecological damage has been just as extreme. Researchers working in areas with heavy python activity have documented catastrophic declines in native mammal populations. Raccoons, opossums, bobcats, marsh rabbits, and white-tailed deer have all but vanished in some of the hardest-hit zones. In one especially telling study, scientists released marsh rabbits fitted with tracking collars into python territory specifically to measure predation rates. Within less than a year, the vast majority of those rabbits had been killed, and pythons were responsible for the overwhelming share of those deaths. When you remove that many prey animals from an ecosystem, everything above them on the food chain suffers too. Birds of prey, native predators, and the overall balance of the Everglades all take the hit. Faced with a crisis that seemed to be spiraling out of control, the state of Florida did what any government under pressure does. It tried to fight back publicly and visibly. Officials launched python bounty hunts, offering cash prizes to hunters who could bring in the biggest or the most snakes. They created professional removal programs, paying trained hunters an hourly wage plus bonuses for every python captured. Some of these hunters became local celebrities in their own right, featured in news segments hauling 18-foot snakes out of canals with their bare hands. Even the state's governor has personally touted the numbers, celebrating removal programs that have pulled thousands of pythons out of the wild since they began. But even with all of that effort, hunters combing the swamps at night with flashlights, specially trained tracking dogs sniffing out nests, and scientists surgically implanting radio transmitters into male scout pythons so they can lead researchers straight to breeding females, the numbers barely make a dent. For every python captured, scientists believe many more remain hidden and breeding. It's a bit like trying to bail out a flooding boat with a teaspoon. The python population in Florida is, for all practical purposes, permanent. Most experts now agree that full eradication is no longer a realistic goal. The mission has shifted from get rid of them to manage the damage and protect what's left. And that shift in mindset is exactly where our story takes its strange turn. The part that gave rise to those viral headlines about Florida releasing snake-killing creatures. While researchers were out in the field studying python behavior, something unexpected started showing up in necropsies, the animal equivalent of an autopsy. Scientists cutting open dead snakes began finding something they weren't expecting: live, thread-like parasitic worms, wriggling their way out of the animal's mouth and throat. At first, this seemed almost like something out of a horror movie. A biology professor examining a dead pygmy rattlesnake in Florida was stunned to see the worms emerging from the snake's body after it had already died. He and his students went on to test other pygmy rattlesnakes in the area, and they found the exact same parasite living inside them, something that had never been documented in that species before. Further research quickly connected the dots. This parasite, a type of pentastome, sometimes casually described as a tongue worm, with a scientific name Relietiella orientalis, is not native to Florida at all. It's originally from Southeast Asia, and its most likely method of arrival should sound very familiar by now. It hitched a ride inside Burmese pythons. Just like their python hosts, these parasites found a brand new home with none of the natural checks and balances that kept their numbers in control back in their native range. Here's where the biology gets genuinely fascinating and a little disturbing. This particular parasite specializes in attacking the respiratory system. It lives and feeds inside the lungs of its host. Burmese pythons, because of their sheer size, have unusually large lungs, which gives them plenty of room to accommodate these worms without much apparent harm. Over countless generations sharing the same environment back in Asia, python and parasite essentially reached an uneasy truce. The worm gets a home, and the snake's immune system has evolved enough resistance to keep the infection from being lethal in most cases. But Florida's native snakes never had that evolutionary head start. When a parasite that's been co-evolving with one species for millions of years suddenly jumps into a completely different species that has zero built-in defenses against it, the results tend to be brutal. Florida's native reptiles, like the pygmy rattlesnake and the black racer, two species that are common across the state, have no evolved resistance to this particular invader. Their smaller lungs simply can't handle the parasite load that a python's massive lungs can shrug off. Infected native snakes have been found severely anemic, struggling to breathe, and in many documented cases, dying as a direct result of the infestation. And this parasite doesn't spend its whole life inside one host. It has a genuinely creepy life cycle that takes it through multiple stages and multiple animals before it ever reaches a snake. It begins its journey in python feces, where its eggs are deposited into the environment. From there, insects like cockroaches come along and consume that waste, unknowingly picking up the parasite's eggs in the process. Those infected insects then get eaten by small mammals and amphibians, which become the parasite's next temporary host. Finally, when a snake, python or otherwise, eats one of those infected animals, the parasite completes its journey, traveling straight to the lungs to begin feeding and reproducing all over again. It's an entire underground relay race of infection, moving silently through the food web long before anyone even realizes it's there. What makes this story especially alarming to researchers is just how far and how fast it has already spread. Since it was first documented, this parasite has been confirmed in dozens of Florida counties, reaching far beyond the swampy corners of the Everglades where the pythons themselves are concentrated. That's the unsettling part. You don't need an actual python nearby for this parasite to show up and start killing local wildlife. Once it establishes itself in the broader ecosystem, moving through insects, frogs, and small mammals, it can spread to native snake populations that have never even encountered a Burmese python directly. In other words, Florida is dealing with two invasive threats layered on top of each other: the pythons themselves and this secondary, almost invisible parasitic invasion riding in their wake. So let's go back to that viral claim that kicked off this whole video: the idea that Florida deliberately released thousands of snake-killing creatures. When you understand the real science, you can see exactly how that narrative got twisted. Nobody in a lab coat stood at the edge of the Everglades with a truck full of parasitic worms and dumped them into the swamp as some kind of biological weapon against pythons. That's not what happened, and frankly, releasing an unpredictable parasite on purpose would be an absurdly reckless strategy for any wildlife agency to attempt. What actually happened is far less like a deliberate plan and far more like an accident nobody could have prevented. The parasite arrived as an unintended hitchhiker on an invasive species that Florida was already desperately trying to control, and it has since taken on a destructive life of its own. That distinction matters enormously, and it's the real stunning truth behind this story. This isn't a tidy narrative about humans cleverly outsmarting nature by fighting one invasive species with another. It's a sobering reminder of how unpredictable and uncontrollable ecological disruption really is once it begins. The python invasion didn't just introduce one destructive species to Florida, it opened a door for an entire hidden ecosystem of parasites and pathogens to slip in right alongside it. And now that door can't simply be closed. Even in an alternate universe where every single Burmese python in Florida vanished tomorrow, this parasite has already spread into native wildlife populations that have nothing to do with pythons at all. It's now a permanent, self-sustaining problem, completely independent of its original host. This is actually a familiar pattern in the history of invasive species, even if this particular chapter is unusually strange. Time and again, the animals or plants that grab headlines, the giant snake, the aggressive insect, the towering weed, turn out to be only the most visible part of a much larger invasion. Hidden underneath is a whole cast of smaller hitchhikers, parasites, diseases, fungi, and microorganisms that tag along for the ride and often do damage just as severe, if not more severe, than the headline species itself. Researchers studying Florida's ecosystems have started referring to this broader phenomenon as a kind of invasion within an invasion, and it's exactly what's playing out with the python parasite today. For the scientists working on the ground, this discovery has reshaped how they think about python management altogether. It's no longer enough to simply count how many pythons get captured each year and celebrate the tonnage removed from the wild. Now, wildlife biologists are also tracking the spread of this parasite through blood samples, necropsies, and population surveys of native snake species across the state. They want to understand exactly how far it has traveled, which species are most vulnerable, and whether some native snakes might eventually develop their own resistance over time, the same way the pythons did back in Asia. That kind of evolutionary adaptation, if it happens at all, would likely take many generations, leaving native populations exposed and vulnerable in the meantime. There's also a public health angle that researchers keep a close eye on, even though the immediate danger to humans from this specific parasite appears low. Pentastomes as a broader family of parasites are known, in rare instances, to infect humans in other parts of the world, usually through contact with contaminated water or improperly handled reptile meat. Florida wildlife officials haven't reported significant human cases tied to this particular python-associated parasite, but its presence is one more reason that hunters, researchers, and anyone handling wild-caught pythons are urged to follow strict safety protocols, including proper protective equipment and safe disposal of carcasses. Meanwhile, the python removal effort itself continues, because letting the primary source of the problem run unchecked would only make everything worse. Programs that pay trained hunters to track and remove pythons have collectively pulled tens of thousands of pounds of snake out of South Florida's wetlands over the past decade alone. Some of the methods being used today sound almost like something from a spy thriller. Researchers surgically implant radio transmitters into captured male pythons, then release them back into the wild during breeding season. These scout snakes instinctively seek out females to mate with, and by tracking their movements, researchers can locate breeding females and their egg clutches that would otherwise be nearly impossible to find in dense marshland. It's a clever, almost ironic strategy, using the snake's own reproductive drive against it. Despite all of this innovation, most experts studying the situation are candid about the odds. The scale of the Everglades, combined with how well pythons have adapted to it, means total eradication is essentially off the table. What remains achievable is damage control, protecting the most vulnerable native species, slowing the spread of pythons into new territory, and now, increasingly, monitoring the secondary threat posed by this parasite as it works its way through the state's native snake populations. So what should you actually take away from all of this? Certainly not the meme version of the story, where Florida gets mocked for supposedly cooking up some wild plan to unleash an army of snake killers. The real story is far more sobering. An invasive species crisis that officials have been fighting for decades has quietly spawned a second, almost invisible crisis, one that spreads through insects, frogs, and small mammals rather than slithering visibly through the grass. It's a reminder that when an ecosystem gets thrown out of balance, the consequences rarely stay contained to the original problem. They ripple outward in ways that even experienced scientists don't always see coming until they are already cutting open a dead rattlesnake and watching worms crawl out of its mouth. Florida's python saga has never been simple, and this latest chapter proves that the state's wildlife challenges are far weirder and far more layered than viral headlines make them out to be. It isn't a story about humans cleverly releasing snake-killing creatures on purpose. It's a story about how one invasive species can drag an entire hidden world of consequences along with it. Consequences that are still unfolding in the swamps, canals, and backyards of Florida right now, whether anyone is watching or not. Let's rewind for a moment and talk about just how these snakes actually got into the Everglades in the first place, because the origin story is almost as wild as everything that's happened since. Florida has long been one of the biggest hubs in the country for the exotic pet trade. Reptile shows, specialty pet stores, and backyard breeders made it easy for almost anyone to walk away with a baby python small enough to fit in a showbox. The problem is that a baby Burmese python doesn't stay small for long. Within a few years, that adorable little snake can grow into a 16-foot animal that requires an enormous, expensive enclosure, regular feedings of large prey, and a level of commitment most casual pet owners simply weren't prepared for. Faced with an animal they could no longer safely house, some owners quietly released their pythons into the wild rather than deal with surrendering or euthanizing them. There's also a long-standing theory, popular among South Florida locals, that a major hurricane in the early 1990s played a role in accelerating the invasion. The storm tore through a python breeding facility, and some believe it allowed a significant number of captive snakes to escape into the surrounding wetlands all at once. Whether that single event was the decisive tipping point or just one contributing factor among many, the outcome was the same. A small number of escaped and released pythons found themselves in a landscape that offered everything they needed to thrive, and almost nothing standing in their way. From that point forward, the growth was almost exponential. Female Burmese pythons reach reproductive maturity within a few years and can produce large clutches of eggs annually. With no natural predators, a nearly endless supply of prey, and a climate that closely mirrors their native Southeast Asian habitat, the population didn't just survive, it exploded. By the time wildlife officials began taking the problem seriously enough to launch coordinated response programs, pythons had already spread across a huge swath of South Florida, from the tip of the Everglades up through Big Cypress National Preserve and into surrounding agricultural and residential areas. The economic and ecological cost of that spread has been enormous. Wildlife agencies have poured millions of dollars into research, trapping programs, and public awareness campaigns.